I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is a legend in Georgia politics, Senator Wayne Garner. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to get to see an old friend and reminisce about all the things that's gone on in the past.
Well, we're anxious for you to share with us some of your memories, beginning with your election to the Senate in 1980. I might add at the tender age of 28.
That's correct.
But before we do, please tell us about your early life over there in West Georgia.
Well, I was actually born in Atlanta at the old St. Joseph Hospital in 1951 in May. And we lived in a little bitty house over on Carr Street. I still remember the address. It was 992 Carr Street, right off of Rice Avenue, across Bankhead Highway from the old Maddox Park. We lived there. Daddy worked at Atlantic Steel, and I had two older brothers, and we were all poor, but we didn't know it. So we moved around a good bit, moved to Douglasville. My mother died of cancer when I was 10, and my two older brothers, I think they were like 13 and 15 when she passed away. We lived in rural Douglas County, then moved to Lithia Springs, and my dad was an alcoholic, and so he had his troubles, and my two older brothers went in the service to escape all that. Well, I wasn't quite old enough to go in the service then, but kind of hung around there, lived. Then we moved into the mill village there in Douglasville, and I left home, had me a job at a drugstore. I was in junior high school. Well, I was in high school. I was in 67, I guess. And Mr. Whitley, who owned the funeral home, he was one of our customers, and I was even in an early age sort of a conniver and a deal maker, and I asked him, I said, do you have a job out there where I could work and live? He said, yeah, I do. I'd like to have you. Said, you can go to school, work in the afternoon. Said, there's a room out there. You can have your own room. And so I went home that night. I quit the drugstore, told Gwen Mara, who was a pharmacist and sort of almost like a father figure. I said, well, Gwen, I'm going to leave you. I got to find me a place to stay, and where the lights are on and the heat works, and so I can get to school. And so I walked home and put all my stuff in two Big Apple paper sacks, a Big Apple grocery store, and I walked across Douglasville that night to the funeral home and moved in with Mr. and Ms. Whitley and stayed there through high school, because I was just about beginning the 11th grade, so 10th grade, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Stayed there, and then went on to West Georgia College, and later on bought that funeral home and operated it. So that, pretty much just a thumb sketch. I mean, we just, like I said, was a very poor family. We had hogs and gardens, and I think my wife and I counted from the time I was born till I married her, I lived in 27 different houses, just moving around. But didn't know any better. So if you've never had it, you can't miss it. So then I married my wife Jerry. We've been married now about 36 years. In October of '74. Had our first child at 77. Always had an interest in politics. We helped when Jimmy Carter ran for president, and I remember being invited to the Democratic Charter Convention in Macon, which would have been in about 75, by a little known state representative in Cartersville named Joe Frank Harris, and he and Ms. Harris drove to Douglasville and picked Jerry and I up, and we rode to Macon, and were invited to a reception at the old Macon Hilton to go up and meet Jimmy Carter and Rosalind, and they were beginning their candidacy to run for president. And we were up there, and I think that whole afternoon there's only 5 or 6 people in the room. Dot Paget, who you remember from out in Douglasville, and Joe Frank and Elizabeth and myself and Jerry, maybe a handful of others. So very few people came because I think, no one had any idea that Mr. Carter would be able to pull that off, but he did. And so that sort of wet my whistle for politics, and I always just sort of thought I might run for something one day. And in January of '80, I was getting ready to go on a duck hunt down on the Altamaha River down near Brunswick. And that night I got up the next morning and found out that our state senator, Eb Duncan, had died of heart issues. So I'll go on the duck hunt, and I was down there thinking in the duck blind. I said, well, I think I'll just go back and run for that. So I did. And I believe there were 7 people in the race, and we wound up in a runoff with Tom Glanton, great guy who was a former House member, had resigned, and he got in the race. Well, Tom and I wound up in the runoff, and that district was basically Newnan, in that northern part of Coweta County, all of Carroll, and about half of Douglas. Well, having been grown up in Douglasville and worked at the funeral home and all, I had a good base there. Hadn't been in Carrollton very long. But nonetheless, we got to run off with Tom, and we led the ticket. And I was getting political advice from a character in Mableton by the name of Jerry Landers. And he and Roy Barnes lived right behind each other, next to each other. And then a guy in Marietta named Wade Scholes, who was an assistant school superintendent, and on the side ran some campaigns, because I didn't know anything about it. So they advised me, said, you just stay away from him. Don't get in a debate with him. And I said, well, don't you think I should? And they said, no, you do not need to get in a debate with him, because you do not even know where the Capitol is. He may ask you what floor is the Senate chamber on, and you don't have a clue. So I never debated him. We just had some joint appearances, but at any rate, and in 3 weeks, we won by about 62%. And it was true. I'd never been to state capitol. I had to call and get directions to get over here to get sworn in. And that was when then Lieutenant Governor Miller was, I believe, was running against Herman Talmadge. Mm-hmm. And Al Holloway was sort of taking over the duties for the lieutenant governor while he was out. So I came over, and Lieutenant Governor Miller was at my swearing in and all that. But when it came time for committee assignments, Al made the assignments. And I remember meeting with him because, Lord God, I was 28 years old and just didn't know a thing. And he asked me what I was interested in, and I said, well, I'd just like to be on a committee where I could just sort of learn the process. And he said, well, that'd be Culver Kids Committee. So he put me on Culver's committee. And
Government operations.
Governmental operations, the best committee in the Senate. And used to be, I heard, was the OE-Reg committee, where Culver actually had subpoena powers, I think. And I think they watered that down and took it away from it. So that began, that's how I got over there, and stayed in the Senate for about 13 years. Then went on the parole board, and then was there during Governor Miller's campaign, I guess his re-election campaign against Milner.
1990?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
let's don't get too far away from
that. Ain't right. So that's sort of how I got here. Just an amazing, fun journey.
Good. Well, before we get too far away from it, tell us about Culver Kid. His name pops up everywhere we go.
Culver Kid was just a wily character, probably one of the smartest people I think I've ever met. I mean, he could keep more in his head, and he took his business very serious. I mean, but he didn't take himself too serious, which is good. But he had 2 goals. One was money and jobs to Milledgeville. That was his main function in life, to see how much he could help Central State. And I mean, they knew him and loved him for that. But he was a colorful character. Zell and made me his babysitter. I had to sit next to Culver, but I learned so much from him. And he would just do the craziest things. I remember one day I heard a beeping sound in the Senate chamber, and I looked over, and this inflatable robot was coming down the center aisle. Culver over there with a remote control, because he had dubbed, he'd gotten mad at Zell about something, called him a robot for Joe Frank Harris, so he had this little robot delivering a message. Zell got mad as hell. And sometimes in the afternoon, Culver would come back from lunch, and he would like to have an occasional gimlet at lunch. Well, this time he had maybe one too many, and he was trying to be recognized to make a speech or respond on a bill, and Zell knew that he didn't probably need to get in the well, so he wasn't recognizing. So in the Senate, they get these microphones on these wires. You'd pull them out, and that'd trigger something, and Zell wouldn't recognize him. Well, Culver gets his microphone on the end of the cord and starts, and I'm having to duck, and he's screaming out, "Oh, great leader! Oh, great leader!" And finally, Zell looked at him and said, "Senator, I'm bending as far backwards to accommodate you as you are leaning sideways to talk to me." So that ended that, and I finally got Culver to sit down. But then he had his office, the Oasis, as you recall, the Oasis, and it was up on the 4th floor. Joe Andrews, who was a lobbyist for the Georgia industrial loan, the small loan folks, he was up there, and he was the bartender. And every afternoon, I mean, the press, members of the Senate, Bobby Parham over in the House, Pete McDuffie from DNR, and everybody just gathered in Culver's office and had a cocktail in the afternoon about 5 o'clock, and it was just nothing nothing thought about it. And sometimes we'd get so many in there, if it was late in the session, we wouldn't have a quorum on the floor, and Zell would call up there, raising Cain, wanting us to get out of the bar and come back down on the floor of the Senate. But he was really something else. But he had a real soft spot for those that didn't have a voice in government. I remember going through the hospitals with him at Central State, and I mean, he was so involved. Even a lot of the patients knew him, and if anybody had a problem down there, they just went to Culver.
Let's talk for a minute, Wayne, about that race in 1980 between Miller and Senator Talmadge. What do you remember about that?
Well, there's a funny story about that, because like I told you, when I got elected to the Senate, like I said, never been to the Capitol, and that race was during the winter, and I got sick. I got pneumonia. I was just out working so hard, and finally, when the race was over, I was just exhausted. The only thing I'd ever in my life heard about the Talmadges were they were just gods. My daddy, this Herman Talmadge and Gene Talmadge, I mean, my daddy liked politics, and he talked about the Talmadge people and how wonderful they were and all this, that, and other. So I'd never met Herman Talmadge, never heard from him, so this sort of sets that up. Finally, election night, about 2 o'clock, everybody finally left the house. I got in bed and went to sleep. And my phone rang about 5:30 in the morning, and I picked it up, and his voice said, "Senator Garner, Herman Talmadge here. I want to congratulate you on a fine victory." And I said, "Right," and I just hung up. I thought one of my friends was playing a joke on me. Well, the phone rang back, and it was this lady. She said, "You did hang up on Senator Herman Talmadge. He'd like to talk to you." And I got on the phone, and I said, "Well, Senator, I'm so sorry. I mean, I had no idea you'd call me. Gosh." And he said, "Well, congratulations." Said, "You've done a good job." Said, "I want you to get busy and help me beat Zell." Said, "He's giving me hell all over the state." And I said, "Well, all right, I didn't know what to say," so I hung up. But I remember that race. I remember watching those the debates when they would. I remember Zell would propose some program at lunch, and then at the debate, the next meeting, Talmadge would have this big post. You remember that as to how much it was going to cost. Yeah. But that was a rough and tumble. It was tumble race, and I think, in the end, maybe justly or unjustly, Governor Miller got credited probably for wounding Herman so bad that Mac Mattingly was able to beat him. But I know when Mac Mattingly beat Herman Talmadge, I had to go put my daddy in the hospital in Villa Rica. I mean, he was physically sick that Herman had been defeated. But it was it was just a tough race. But I know later on they made amends and
So you got elected to the Senate. Come over here to the Capitol. Walk us through your first day.
Well, the first day, I remember, because I'd gotten elected, like I said, on April Fool's Day in 1980. Dot Paget said, when you get over there on your first day, there's been another young man down in South Georgia by the name of Paul Trulock that's been elected to the Senate. She said, you look him up, and I think y'all will be great friends and comrades. So that was the first day I got over here and went over and introduced myself to Paul. That's been 30 years ago, and we to this day talk 2 or 3 times a week. We have our mountain cabins are within a mile of each other. We've been all over the world together with our wives, and so I guess that first day is where I met Trulock and began to meet some other members of the Senate, and sitting there still kind of scratching my head is how did I get from 992 Carr Street to the Senate. Then shortly after that I realized everybody there was about the same. Everybody had their different stories. Then I made friends with Paul, and then Roy Barnes, and I had been friends even prior to that. His neighbor Jerry Landers helped me, and Roy, I used to call him for advice. I mean, one of the big issues back then was the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And my opponent was for that, and I didn't even know what it was. And I asked Roy, I said, what's this ERA stuff? So he kind of told me. He said, I said, well, my opponent's for it. I guess maybe I ought to be against it. I said, have you got any good reasons why I could be against it? So Roy, he didn't care what side it was. So he gave me a list of things and that ended up sort of being the conservative right philosophy. So I met Roy and Pierre. Gang of Five. And that was Trulock, and then that was in the lady. It was Ed Hine, Pierre Howard, Roy Barnes, myself, and Trulock. And the press dubbed us the Gang of Five. We were the Young Turks, and we spent an entire summer crafting legislation, sort of populist, like campaign finance disclosure, just on and on and on. And we had a stack of it, and we introduced it on the first day of that session, and it was promptly all defeated and killed in committee. But interestingly enough, everything we proposed became law within 6 or 7 years, just under different names. As they began to look at what you do with leftover campaign funds. That was one of the proposals from the Gang of Five, and we said, you either give it back or you give it to a charity. You can't declare it income, because you remember back those days you could. I remember congressmen, when they changed that law, a lot of them didn't run that year because they had $500,000 in their campaign account that they could declare as income. And that was one of the things. Other thing was like retirement bills. We had a piece of legislation that says this. It wasn't law then, but it's law now, that a retirement bill can't pass in 1 year. You got to introduce it 1 year and pass it the second. Because as you recall, those retirement bills had come out of committee, and on the last night of the session, they really could get some strange amendments put to them, and so that's now law. That was something the Gang of Five proposed. Campaign finance disclosure is now law, and that was something the Gang of Five proposed, and several other things.
The rumor at the time was that the Gang of Five ran into Hugh Gillis
we ran into Hugh Gillis, and I think Zell dispatched Hugh to kill all that, because Hugh was quoted in the paper, said that it's been taken care of.
Tell us about Senator Gillis.
He was quite a character. I really got to know and respect and like Hugh. He sat right in front of Culver and myself, and we would all huddle. And there were generational differences, because I was 28 and he had been up here longer than I had been living, and but we got along well and liked it. If you sit next to somebody or in the same room with somebody for 40 days, you really get to know that person. I sat next to Render Hill before they made me go sit next to Culver, and we just became wonderful friends. And through that experience, I think back on I don't guess there's a county that I don't know somebody. And I get calls living in Carrollton, across the street from the University of West Georgia. A lot of children from around the state, and a lot of people call and say, Wayne, just like last year, I got a call early one morning from Trip Martin. His son was in the fraternity out there, and they'd had one of the fraternity brothers gotten killed in an automobile accident that night. And he woke me up and he said, will you go out there and be with him? And so I called our preacher, and it's just that kind of relationship all over the state that you enjoy, having just served with those folks. I sat next to Judge Quillian Baldwin, and one thing I tell my son, who has started his own governmental affairs, he worked with Zell in Washington for the whole time he was there, and he said, well, Dad, you got any pointers? I said, the only pointer I can give you is you treat everybody fair and be respectful, because you never know, number one, it's the right thing to do, but you never know where they'll wind up. And he learned that lesson last year. We had a piece of legislation we were working on, and David Ralston was going to carry it for us, so we had to walk 40 miles over here to find David after he had been defeated as Speaker. And 2 weeks later, he was Speaker of the House. So
never know.
You never know.
That's right. Do you remember the first bill you introduced?
I'm trying to recall. I think the first thing I introduced was a resolution honoring and commending Senator Duncan, and had his family up and all that sort of stuff. I remember the first. I don't think I introduced a bill the first year. I did. The second year I introduced the first bill, and it dealt with a criminal issue. We had a young girl that was killed in Carrollton by another teenager, and the law prevented his name from being in the paper because you couldn't print the name of juvenile offenders. But it didn't apply to victims, so her name was in the paper, and it was not the best set of circumstances, and it really hurt the family. So I put a bill in there. If you're going to exclude the criminal, you should not be able to identify the victim. I passed it in the Senate, and it got over into the House Judiciary Committee, and I had to go before the House Judiciary Committee, and one infamous representative, Mr. Denmark Groover from Macon, got my bill and looked at it, and he said, young man, you're to be commended. Said it would take a genius to get a bill this unconstitutional halfway through a legislature. Said, but it stops here, so I just, okay, I try. But then Denny and I, from that, I got to meet him and know and love him and learn of all his goings on and his grooverizing. Yes, he could read a bill and just tell you everything was in it in just a second.
Well, Senator, you served with 3 Georgia governors, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, Governor Busby,
Joe Frank Harris, and Governor Miller.
And Governor Barnes.
So it's 4.
4, yeah. I stayed, because I had planned to leave when Senator Miller left, because the job he had me in, you had to have a strong support system, and I'd go to war with Zell. But after I was ready to leave, and I told Governor Barnes, I said, I'm going to cut out of here. And he said, well, how about staying through the session? So I did, and then left after.
Tell us about George Busby.
I think the most embarrassed I've ever been, but it tells you what kind of guy George Busby was. My son, who is now 32, was, let's see, he was born in 77. He was 3 when I got elected. And Tom Daniel invited us. I knew Tom had met him in another way, but he invited us to, of course, come over, and when we got sworn in, to come and meet Governor Busby. Well, that was, that's huge. When you're 28 years old, you're about to go meet the governor. Well, I had Griffin and my wife, and we get to the door, knock on it, and Busby opened the door, and Griffin looked up at him and said, "Hello, dummy," and took a flip, just did a flip right over in the office. Well, I was mortified, and my wife she nearly cried. And Busby just howled and picked Griffin up, and they played, because he had grandchildren, and they got to be buddies, and so they, even when I'd bring Griffin over, Busby would want to see him. But he was, I really liked him, one of them, and he had a good way about it. Somebody described him, a guy with an iron fist with a velvet glove on. I mean, he could be tough. I remember Trulock they had the budget before the Senate. You never really fool with the budget. And they were trying to buy this parking lot over in front of the railroad depot. Paul and I thought that wasn't a good way to expend any money, so we put in a floor amendment to take it out. People like Culver, who loved to get in any kind of fight, they joined with us. And Paul got up in the well and said he smelled a rat, that there's something wrong. We didn't need to be buying that parking lot. And, well, we passed the amendment. Unbelievable. Well, it wasn't about an hour. Governor Busby called the two of us down there, and I mean, in no uncertain terms, he told us that was his project and that was his parking lot, and he didn't give a damn how we got it undone, but we'd better get it undone. And I don't know how we got the bill back up before he scared us to death, and we got that amendment put back in, and that's how the depot parking lot got purchased. And then another time, one of the real interesting things about Busby is Paul Brown. You remember the old Paul Brown? When Jimmy Carter got defeated and was coming home to Plains, the Senate was going to, take people down there on various planes, and Paul Brown was in charge of getting up everybody to go down there. And well, he ran out. He told me I could go. Then somebody senior to me wanted to go, and he just came and said, "You're off the list. You can't go. You hadn't been here long enough. Just somebody else is going." Well, it made me mad, and I called Tom Daniel and I said, "You know how I might get down to Plains and see the president come home? Y'all got a plane going or a bus or something?" He said, "Sure." He said, Governor Busby's flying down there with him, and he said, "We're sending a plane to pick Governor up, so you just ride down there with him, and you can ride back with the governor." And so I went down on the governor's plane and rode in with a trooper. It was raining after that was over, and I was standing by Paul Brown, and he said, "How'd you get down here?" He said, I rode on the governor's plane. And then his trooper pulled up and got me and left Paul in the rain. And Governor Busby flew back, and the weather was bad. And I remember Miss Mary Beth sat there and she said, "George, I don't like this. But he had a state pilot up there, and we got back. But just a neat guy. I came up with this idea one time when he was governor to have the inmates refurbish school buses. And they have a program in Texas. And so I went out there and looked at that program, and they'd take a school bus at the end of its lifespan and send it to this prison garage, and for about $12,000 make it brand new instead of buying another $50,000. So anyway, so I started working on that, and I got a message that Governor Busby wanted to see me. So I go down there, because I, politically naive. I went down and I walked in. He said, "How's your school bus project coming along?" I went to tell him all about it, and he said, "Well, we're not going to do that." I said, "We're not." I said, well, this sure does make a lot of sense. He said, no, we're not going to do that. He said, you probably don't know. He said, you ever heard of the Luces? I said, yes, sir. I think I have. He said, well, they make school buses down in South Georgia. He said, they don't like this. And he said, they've been good supporters of mine. I said, okay. So that ended the school bus refurbishing, but always just a gentleman.
Very progressive governor.
Very progressive governor. Smart. I mean, he knew the budget. Just a delight to be around. I remember the great nights at the mansion. He and the speaker would get up and sing, and it wasn't so mean-spirited back then. And, you really, and it was very impressionable for somebody 28, 29 years old to be in those circles.
Joe Frank Harris.
Great, wonderful man. Like I told you, way before I ever thought about being in politics, I got to know Joe Frank Harris and stayed up with him. And when he ran for governor, went all over the state for him, working. I mean, we had fly-arounds for him, and then when he got elected, just did a lot of great stuff, and we were good friends. I got mad at him because I thought I should have been his assistant floor leader, and he named Nathan Dean the floor leader. And we'll get back to a story about that in a minute. But worked well with him. I mean, I think he was very quiet, laid back, just strong, great guy. A lot of people says his administration might have been a little boring. He was did not have a lot of fanfare about him. One of my great Joe Frank stories is Carlton Caldwell. You remember Carlton?
See him every day.
Well, you can ask him about this. When Joe Frank was running, Tom Perdue sent me down to the Parole, I believe it was a Parole or probation convention, I believe, at Jekyll Island, to be on a panel with the gubernatorial candidates. And it was Bo Ginn, and I'm trying to remember who all was in it. Norman Underwood, and they really wanted to nail Norman Underwood. They was mad at him about something. And so we get down there, and there's an act in Georgia called the Police Indemnification Act. And if a police officer gets killed in the line of duty, the state at that time gave him $50,000. The probation officers and parole officers were excluded from that. So I told Carlton, I said, well, we'll tear old Norman Underwood up. I said, we'll just say if Joe Frank's elected, we'll just make a little promise that we'll bring them under that act. So they all made the speeches, and I got up to represent Joe Frank, and I said, I'm glad to let you know that Representative Harris, that one of the main things he's going to do if he gets elected is he's going to bring the probation officers under the police indemnification. Oh, they just went wild and applauded, and Norman got mad and said I didn't have the authority to promise that, blah, blah. Make a long story short, Joe Frank got elected, and Carlton Caldwell and myself and Governor Harris, he asked us to fly with him down to Savannah to some meeting. We thought we were just being rewarded. So we get on the plane, and Carlton had a newspaper he was just kind of looking at, and Joe Frank looked at me and said, I want to know about this Police Indemnification Act and how the probation officers, their association has come to me and said that I'd promised that if I was elected I'd do that. And he said, can you tell me how that came about? Well, Carlton just took that paper and put it up. I said, well, Governor, I said, Perdue sent me down there to represent you at that convention, and I thought we had to come up with something, some real good deal for them to support you. And I asked Carlton, I said, Carlton, we need to promise these people something. And Carlton said, promise them anything, he's going to get the hell beat out of him anyway. So Carlton threw the paper down in the plane. He said, now, Governor, you know, I never told him any such a thing as that. Well, Joe Frank just died laughing. He said, well, the reason I got you guys on this plane, said, if y'all promise anything else, said, I need to know about it. So, but he had a good sense of humor, and but that was my best remembrance of Joe Frank. But
QBE.
Quality Basic Education.
That was his baby.
And I guess still portions of it is in effect. Mm-hmm. But I remember Roy Barnes was his floor leader. For some reason, one of the interesting behind the scenes things about that is that Joe Frank wanted that bill to pass unanimous in both houses. Mm-hmm. And we worked hard, and we had 55 votes in the Senate. The holdout of all things was Hodge Timmons from Blakely, Jimmy Hodge, mm-hmm. who was an educator by profession. You know, as usual, when you reform an education, like most of the time the teachers or some of the educational groups are against it, and there was some against some portions of that. Mm-hmm. And I kept telling Roy, I said, Hodge not going to vote for it. He said, yeah. So finally, I think Roy went down to see Joe Frank and said, Hodge is not going to vote for it. Joe Frank, and he took way out of character for him, he said, send him down here to see me. So Hodge goes in, and he says everything twice. He said, Governor, how you doing? And I said, Hodge, I'm fine. I said, sit down. He said, I hear you're not going to vote for QBE. Mm-hmm. Well, Governor said, you're right, I'm not. I just can't get that in my crawl. And Joe Frank said, well, Hodge, I'm going to tell you something. If you vote against that bill, I'm going to line item veto every dime in your district. Not only this year, but every year I'm here. You will not get another penny. Do we understand each other? Hodge flew out of that office and came back up and sat down, and I said, well, Hodge, what you gonna do on QBE? He said, when that thing comes up, my hand's gonna be like weeds behind the outhouse. Said, I'm for every bit of it. Said, I didn't understand it till I had it explained to me a while ago. So we called the vote, and the bill passed 56-0, and that was one of the few times, Joe Frank really ever strong-armed anybody, but he got Hodge's attention. So from then on, we'd laugh about from time to time you'd get a bill explained to you.
Zell Miller.
Zell Miller. My mentor, if I've got one, that would be him, and he is. He's been a great dear friend to me for a long, long time. And what was, when he was lieutenant governor, we just getting fired. Not he and I, but I mean, if he wanted to do something, we didn't mind taking him on. We'd mix it up. Now everything's so, you can't amend this bill if it's got this on it and all that. But it was just free for all back in those days. So we didn't always give him everything he wanted, but he enjoyed a good fight. Mm-hmm. And when he first ran for governor, I supported Roy Barnes against him. Mm-hmm. Because Roy and I were just great friends, and so Zell just beat the stew out of us. Mm-hmm. And I called him the next day. I said, well, I've sinned and come up short. And he said, well, you can be redeemed for $3,000 or whatever it was. So we took him some campaign money. Yeah. And helped him. And then that was the year Peer got elected. Mm-hmm. And I ran for majority leader. Mm-hmm. And got elected majority leader. But, since I didn't support Zell, I didn't go to all the festivities. But once he got sworn in and was in office, I made an appointment to go down there to see him. And it was an icy reception. And I said, well, I come down here to tell you something. I said, I didn't do one single thing to help you become governor. In fact, I tried to beat you. But you beat us. But what I'm down here to tell you is that I will do anything you need me to do to make you the best governor we've ever had. And he just kind of coldly said, okay. And I got up to leave, and he said, wait a minute. Turned around, he came over and shook my hand. He said, I cannot be governor and do like I used to do and hold grudges and be mad at folks. He said, I appreciate you coming down here and he said, now you voted against my lottery. I said, I'll pass it for you. Don't worry about it. We'll pass it. And so everything that he wanted, and he and Pierre were close. I mean, he fought. All his fights were in the House. We took care of him in the Senate, and whatever he needed and wanted passed, and we passed the lottery. And then we developed this friendship. And then the flag, you know, he called us all in and going to change the flag. And I said, have you lost your mind? And he said, well, you going to help me? I said, yeah, I'll help you. And that thing just went all, you remember how bad it got. He got Pete Robinson and I was president pro tem at the time. Pete was majority leader or something. For us to come up with a compromise on the flag bill. So Pete and I sat up all night one night trying to think of a compromise. So we came up with this idea. Basically, it was a white flag and a black flag. We're going to have the official state flag would be what Zell wanted. Mm-hmm. And we would have a state commemorative flag, which was the existing flag. And you could fly either one of them. But if you came to the Capitol to get a flag, you would get this flag. And our logic was through attrition and over some span of time, the other flag would go away. But on state buildings and schools and this and other, you had to fly the official state flag. But anyway, so we took that to him, and he said, well, I like that. That might work. So Pete and I floated that thing. And it's really the first time anybody out my way knew that I was for changing the flag. I mean, they never asked about it. We floated that thing, and in a few minutes they sent a message from the governor's office, said that the governor has dispatched the state patrol, Pete, to your home in Columbus, and Wayne to your home in Carrollton. Said there are threats that they're going to burn them down. So, I called my wife. I go in and I called her and I said, y'all all right? She said, we're fine. She said, but can you tell me why we're state troopers are in this house? I said, feed them, take care of them. Somebody wants to burn it down because I've gotten tangled up in this damn flag. Well, yeah, that went on for a while. We had protection for our amendment. The compromise got beat, and we couldn't pass anything in the Senate, and then after that, Zell dropped it. But shortly after that, I went to him and I said, I'm about done. I've had about all this I want. I'm going to go do something else. And he said, well, instead of quitting, he said, this was like halfway through was in 93. Was it 93? Yeah. So he was about to gear up to run against Milner. He said, how about going over to the parole board? I've got an opening over there, and you know, they're saying I'm soft on crime and this, that, and other. Go over there and kind of beef that up a little bit. So that's what I did. That's how I left the Senate, and then stayed there a couple of years. Then
appointed you Commissioner of Corrections. Let's talk about corrections.
All right, let me back up just a minute. A little known secret of how I got to be Commissioner of Corrections, and this has never been told publicly, but I had a little farm down in Heard County, and I was down there one afternoon and got a call that the governor wanted to see me the next day, which would have been like a Thursday. So I go up to his office and walked in. He said, Garner, you want to be Secretary of State? And that's when Max Cleland had resigned to run. I said, well, I never really thought about that. He said, there's several want it. Said, I don't know them anything. Said, but you've been loyal to me and worked hard, and said, if you want it, you can have it. Probably the biggest mistake I ever made in my life, because I didn't think that was enough action for me. And I said, I don't know, let me think about it over the weekend, instead of a fool and just saying, absolutely, I want to be Secretary of State. He said, well, you let me know. And if you want it, you can have it. So I go home and told Jerry this about Thursday, Friday. And, well, And we kind of made up our mind on Monday I'd go back and tell him. Well, Sunday morning the phone rung at the house, and it was Governor Miller. He said, forget Secretary of State. Said, you got to go to correction. Said, Alan Alt called me yesterday and resigned. And so that's how I got to corrections.
But you had been chairman of that committee in the Senate for a long time.
Long time. Had been chairman of that committee a long time. And I was on the parole board at that time. Had been there about 3 years. And Alan and Zell just didn't get along. Alan, I don't know where he's right or wrong, but I mean, he had a very liberal philosophy on how you run prisons and how you, to Zell he did. Mm-hmm. He insisted that inmates be called clients and not inmates, and that was rubbing raw on Miller. And so finally, Alan decided he needed to leave. And so I told him on Sunday, I said, absolutely, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. He said, well, come over here in the morning, let's talk about it. So we talked about it. He told me what he wanted to do. Because if you recall, the year prior to that, we had two riots in 2 prisons in the state, millions of dollars worth of damages, injuries. It was horrible. It was just in a state of just kind of messed up. He said, we're going to straighten this out. He said, we're going to make a prison a prison. I said, okay, if that's what you want to do, that's what we'll do. And so I got sworn in, and then on Pearl Harbor Day, I don't know why my appointments all hit on crazy days. I was elected on April Fool's Day and sent to correction on Pearl Harbor's Day, December the 7th, 1995. And I began to put my team together. A great Paul Melvin, who is still in state government, was the deputy commissioner, and Jerry Thomas, A.G. Thomas, who had been a long-time career employee with corrections, was warden at Jackson. We brought him in over facilities, and we put together a great legal team headed by Christopher Hamilton, who had been legal at Parole, and just put a good group together. And my first day on the job, I got a call early in the morning and said, Commissioner, you need to go to Lee Arendelle. There's been an inmate killed up there, a 17-year-old boy. So we all go up there and begin to try to figure out what happened. He'd been shanked. And I got there, they hadn't moved him. He was still laying in the pool of blood where he died. And I told those men, I said, this is the last one on my watch. It's not going to happen. It's going to be rough getting to where we need to be, but this crap's going to stop. And so I looked at Jerry. I said, Jerry, and I said, I'm new to this. I said, how you stop this? He said, well, you got to go through every prison with your tactical teams, search every cell, get all the contraband out. He said, that hadn't been done in years. And he said, you would be amazed what we're going to find. I said, well, let's start today. So we brought the tactical team in and shook down Lee Arendelle. We hauled out knives, tattoo machines, hooch-making apparatus, and cleaned all that up, limited to what they could have. And Alan had stratified the prisons differently. He and a lot of people believe that if you've got a group of good inmates, basically, that behave, you can put a few bad ones in there and they'll modify their behavior to good. Well, it doesn't work that way. The bad modify the good's behavior to bad. So we re-stratified all the prisons, took all the meanest of the mean and put them in several institutions, and those that wanted to, just finish their sentence and mind their own business, and we did that. Then we began systematically going through all called hell about it. Got sued every day by the Southern Center for Human Rights. But we went through all the prison facilities, cleaned them all out. If we'd find a lot of stuff at a prison, we'd fire that warden and put another warden in, and so this is how this is going to be run. It's not rocket science. You're dealing with 40,000 people that read at a 5th grade level, and about 75% of them are mean. So that's what we began to do, and as a result, for the 5 years that we was there, my first day was the only day that an inmate was killed. And if you and we caught unshirted hell about the Hayes shakedown, but it finally got settled. But through those 5 years, at the end of my tenure, pretty much at the end of my tenure, I ordered a forensic audit from Pete Marwick. They came in and audited the prison up and down, compared it around the country, and basically, and interviewed Judge Tony Alamo, who he and I got to be great friends during all that. And he said we had modeled and developed one of the best prison systems in the country. Now, Cynthia Tucker didn't think that at the AJC, but that's what we did.
I've read that, looked at that audit, and it said, and I'm quoting here, that you build a prison system without peer in the Southeast.
Well, I think we did.
And that's something to be proud of, because Georgia has been known over the years nationally as a chain gang state.
Right. We didn't support chain gang. One of the things we caught real grief on, Bob, is that we fired all the prison teachers. If you think about that, you think, how stupid. Well, I talked to Governor Miller about it. I said, we're teaching, we had, I think, I'm trying to remember how many we had. It may be like 150 or something like that, prison teachers. Averaging salary was about $50,000 a year. And prisons are designed to move very slow. You get up and you got to open this door to get here and that door to get there, then you eat, and then this door to get back. So they were only teaching about 3 hours a day, not any fault of theirs. So we decided we were going to start, number one, teaching the GED. We issued more GEDs in that 5 years than in the history of the prison system. And we stopped teaching so much vocational technical. We were of the opinion that if you can get these guys a GED, it's almost like a mini liberal arts degree. Then when they get out, they can decide what they want to do. So we started tele-teaching. We'd find the best person in the world to teach GED, and we'd put 30 inmates in a room, one correctional officer, and pipe it in. And we started having these graduations, and they started getting their GEDs, and then they went on to do other things. So that was important. And the stratification was important. People thought we were being mean-spirited and going around beating hell out of these inmates. That wasn't the case at all. I mean, if you look through that Pete Marwick audit, and another thing they didn't know, that we had opened channels of communication with Judge Alamo. We ran everything by him because, he was just not only, his heart was in the right place, he gave us good advice. So, I mean, we weren't just willy-nilly going around the state. We talked to him. And he began to look at the incidents of inmate-on-inmate assaults were just at rock bottom. Inmate-on-staff assaults were at rock bottom, because we had those mean guys, off dealing with them, and the other folks that wanted to get a GED and try to do better, could do it. But the notion of into these prisons in the middle of the night, shaking them down, I guess it had a lot of editorial romanticism, so they wrote about it. And but Judge Alamo was a huge help to us. But so we went 5 years without an inmate death, which is plus in '95 when I went there, our budget was $600 million. When I left in 2000, our budget was $600 million. We never increased the budget in 5 years.
They could use you over there now.
Yeah, we could figure something out.
When we were talking about governors, we didn't quite get around to Roy Barnes. Let's talk about him for a minute.
Roy Barnes, I tell about him, he could call me right now and convince me to jump out that window, just head first. We have just been best friends a long time. He's brilliant, and he just tried to do too much. I think, that first term, and I told him about that. I said, "You're trying to don't fool with reapportionment." I said, "The court's going to draw that. Don't fool with the flag. Do that in your second term if you feel like you just have to." But he just created a perfect storm to get beat. Mm-hmm. And I think, he may be the perfect storm may be created for him to come back. We'll see. We'll know in a few months. Mm-hmm. But we're more, there was, with Busby and Harris and Miller, there was a generational difference. Roy and I are more, of the same generation, and there's not that, when Zell Miller told me to do something, I did it. If Roy told me to do something, I might argue with him for a little bit about it. But just one of my best friends I made during the Senate. I remember when my son had his head injury when he was 10. Roy and Marie stayed with us at Eggleston all night long, and we lost our child in December. They were the first ones at the house, and you don't back up on people like that. Just good folks.
Speaking of Zell Miller, the constant feuding between him when he was lieutenant governor and Tom Murphy, two powerful men, is legendary. What do you think about that? Was that good or bad for the state?
I think it was good for the state. I think it was good for the state. Those are two different guys, but they just like to fight. Now that was, they didn't really give a dadgum what the topic was, because somebody asked me one time about Murphy and Miller was in a big fight, and it was in Governor Miller's second term, and they said, "Why don't you talk to Zell? Get him to just relax and have some fun." I said, "He is having fun." I said, "That's what those two old war horses do." And I know Terry Coleman and I was on the conference committee, and the Senate and the House budget conference committees, and they'd get all locked down on something, Miller and Murphy, and they'd all get to fighting, and Pierre'd be on one end of it, and Terry and I, we'd get in those conference committees and be snipping at each other, and finally we stopped the meeting and went outside, and I said, "We don't need to do this." I said, "We can't settle a thing." And I said, "Generals don't get killed in war. Lieutenants do." So I said, "Let's just shut up till they decide what they want to do." And in the end, they would come around, and because I know when we fired those prison teachers, Mr. Murphy had a fit because all of them had they enjoyed some constituency in the legislature with, and he called me. I remember, and he was with the Green Door Committee, and he said, "I'm about to put, $25 million back in your budget to hire those prison teachers." I said, "Don't put it in. I'm not going to hire them back." I said, "You got the wrong number." I said, "You need to call the man on the second floor." I said, because when we took them out, the governor made it clear to me, he said, "You better not cut a deal and put them back in, or I'll have your hide." So I said, "You talking to the wrong one." He said, "You mean you're telling the Green Door Committee you won't spend that money if we?" I said, "No, sir, not going to spend it." I said, "You got to call." I said, "You've got the wrong number." I said, "You need to call the governor." Yeah. So finally they settled it, but I think it was good. I think it was good for the state. That's one of the things that I look at now, how debate is limited in the legislature now, and the rules that comes out of the Rules Committee is structured or non-amendable, or that's not good. I mean, that's why, to me, you've got 180 House members and 56 senators. You put a bill out there, it's going to be a law of the land, you debate it, you argue about it, and at the end, you'll have a good product. I mean, Pierre Howard used to say that, and I didn't agree with him a lot of times. I kind of just benevolent dictator kind of leadership is what I like, but Pierre always said, if you put enough people at the table and you be patient long enough, you'll come out with a good solution. And I think that's why that was good, the Murphy and Miller form of government. You just hashed it out, you fought about it, you thought about it. And, you know, let's face it, politics is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's a pugilistic job. I mean, that's why you do it. You like to fight, and you like to argue, and you like to, you know, try not, but not be personal about it. I mean, a great example of skin edge. When I was majority leader, he was minority leader, and we fought all week. But on many weekends, his wife and my wife and the two of us would go off to our mountain cabin and spend the weekend and have dinner and sit there and read and not bother each other, and then come back Monday and go back. We had a great respect and a friendship. We just saw things differently. But there was no need to be hateful or mean-spirited about it. You know, when my dad died in 1992, I mean, you know, skin edge was one of the first ones at the funeral. I mean, you know, just had that kind of relationship. And I think we got a lot done. But I do think I like the old way of just battling it out every day. And Miller had a knack, Bob. He had like this teacher thing. He'd come up with something before every session and throw it out there. And it was like a rabbit at a dog track. They'd just chase that thing and raise hell and fuss and fight, and it really wasn't anything he was interested in, but he'd finally wear out about halfway through the session, and then in the meantime, while they were chasing the rabbit, the teachers, whatever, he got all this stuff he wanted to do done. And it was just, every year it was another, I remember the speech at the Eggs and Issues breakfast when he got up and just took the hide off Murphy and called it the House Murphy's Mausoleum. You remember that?
I remember
he said,
that, yeah.
All my bills are entombed over there, and made Tom so mad he didn't talk for 2 weeks, but he got a lot of stuff done.
You announced for lieutenant governor in 1990.
That's right.
Then changed your mind.
Well, didn't change my mind. Announced in 1990 and began campaigning all across the state. We were doing good in raising money. And it was at that time that my son wrecked his go-kart on a Sunday afternoon and had a compressed skull fracture and a very serious head injury. And he kind of got over that and then went into a post-traumatic stress situation, and we had to take care of him. He had to have counseling twice weekly for about a year and a half, so that's when we folded the tent and got out of the lieutenant governor's race and dealt with that. And then I supported Pierre. When I got out, I indicated my support for him, and then he, as you know, I guess he and Joe Kennedy get in the runoff?
Yeah.
That's right. And he didn't win it on the first ballot, got in the runoff, and then he ultimately got elected. And then
let's talk for a minute about party politics. It seems, at least to me, that nowadays to be a Democrat is to be a liberal, and to be a Republican is to be a conservative. That has not always been that way.
No, it has not, and I don't know how it got to that point. I guess maybe Washington, the national politics has probably driven that agenda more than anything, because I know people, my friends, you know, of course, view me as conservative, and see, I can't believe you're a Democrat at one time. I said, we were conservative. I said, I was a Democrat, and the Democrats controlled the state Senate, but let me give you an example. The Democrats in that body passed a bill one time to put the electric chair in a van and haul it county to county to electrocute people. I said, now, how liberal is that? So I think that's what, you know, Miller found when he got to Washington, that a Georgia Democrat has no place in the national party. But that hadn't always been the case. But I think it's been, to me, it's just been driven in the ground that I think the public is tired of that. They don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican. They want this fighting and bickering to stop. And I think they ought to change the law over there. If you want to run as an independent, just qualify as an independent and get away from all this party stuff, because to me, there's not a dime's worth of difference in either party. When the Republicans, and let's just face it, under Governor Perdue, when they took over the House and the Senate, not one single thing changed. It was spend and campaign and raise money and have these extravagant fundraisers, and you know, it was all the same. And the Democrats did the same thing, and it's gotten all about money. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why people would never. Somebody asked me, "So why don't you run for Congress?" I said, "Hell, I'm afraid I might win." And you spend your entire career up there raising money. Mm-hmm. I mean, the average congressman, I guess, has to raise $100,000 a month to be competitive. And even now, state Senate seats are $250,000. That's crazy. Mm-hmm. So I wish we could get away from all the party. It'd suit me not to have any party. Just run. Just how you want to run. Whoever gets the most votes wins. I don't know. You got to have, I guess, some structure to it. But I do think a lot of people would run. There was an interesting piece in the paper the other day about how difficult it is in Georgia to run as an independent and how many signatures you have to get.
Almost impossible.
It's almost impossible. And it should be just a matter of qualifying if you want to run as an independent. Because I would, in this next governor's race, I think if you had a strong independent candidate that said, I don't give doesn't make any difference, we're going to do what's right for Georgia, and it's not going to be Democrat or Republican. I think when one of the things that made Senator Miller so immensely popular is when Governor Barnes appointed him, and he said, I'm going to Washington to serve neither party. I'm going to serve the people of Georgia. And I mean, I think that put in place for him to be so effective. And then when he got up there, it was a breath of fresh air that he didn't, I went with him. This is a great story. As you recall, the election really didn't get decided to November. And I flew with Senator Miller out to Austin when he met with the president. Mm-hmm. My son and I did, went out there and came back. I said, well, what was the meeting about? He said, it was about education. I said, well, you going to help him? He said, yeah, I told him I'd help him. I said, I told him I was for his tax bill, too. And I think Bush was so taken aback that he couldn't believe it. But there was things that needed to be done, and Miller was there just making those right down, down the middle road decisions without consulting party. I mean, he didn't line up with the Democrats all the time.
Well, Wayne, we could go on for hours, but I'd like to close by asking you these personal questions.
All right.
First of all, if you had your career to go over again, what would you do differently?
If I had my career to go over, I would remember that very moment in Zell Miller's office when he said, do you want to be Secretary of State? I'd have said yes and not let him back down. I think that's the biggest mistake I ever made. But
what was your proudest moment in politics?
Let me think about that just a little bit. I enjoyed all of it so much. I just can't put my finger on the proudest
accomplishment.
The proudest accomplishments.
You don't think it would be your tenure as Commissioner of Corrections?
I think that was the most fun I've ever had for a 5-year span. Now, my wife didn't think it was very much fun, but I think we did a lot of good. Perhaps on the parole board, when you'd give somebody an opportunity to get out and do better, and they did it, that made you feel good. I think just the whole culmination of all of it, that in that span of time, going to Russia with the lieutenant governor and getting to go to Israel and meet all these great, wonderful people that are now friends. I think the whole thing would be the proudest moment, but I can't really reach back and put one thing. I do think the creation and helping Governor Miller create the Hope Scholarship, probably if you had to put a crown on something, it would be that we actually did something that has sustained itself and very well and has educated thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kids that wouldn't have had a chance. So I guess if you're going to put anything on that, it would be the helping him create the hope.
Your biggest disappointment? You've already said it.
Yeah.
You didn't take the job.
I should have took the job. I should have took Cleveland's job. I remember I told him, I said, that must be like being a clerk of court somewhere. So, but I didn't make it. I got it snatched back on Sunday.
Finally, Wayne, how would you like to be remembered?
Oh, I'd like to be remembered as someone that came up here and did their job and made a difference and treated everybody the same. We didn't let all that stuff go to our head and be so haughty and high and mighty.
Have we missed anything?
Well, I believe we've covered it all.
There's nothing that
There's
nothing about Wayne Garner we've left out?
I can't think of a single thing other than turning the airplane off on the lieutenant governor when he wouldn't help me with something. He got elected and he'd promised me he'd help me be majority leader. And Don Johnson got in the race. Well, Pierre was kind of hard. Sometimes he'd be difficult to make a decision. And this was in right before we were about to have these elections. He called and wanted me to fly him. I did some flying back then and had a friend of mine that had a good plane, so we picked Pierre up and Lewis Massey and Shannon Mayfield. Flew to Cairo. The senator down there, I can't think of his name at the time, he got on the wrong side. He was for Joe Kennedy, so he was trying to make up and had a barbecue for Pierre. And so we flew down there. Pierre never mentioned the majority leader's race. So coming back, I told Lester, he flew down there, I said, let me fly back. I said, don't pay any attention when I pull the power back on this plane. So we took off. It was in the black dark of night, coming out of Cairo. We got up to about 8,000 or 9,000 feet. And we had these headsets on, and Pierre was sitting back there. And I just reached up and turned the engine off. And it was just as quiet. And Pierre started just screaming in the headset. What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? I said, well, can you hear me? And he said, hell yes, I can hear you. What's wrong with the engine? I said, it's not running. And it's not going to run. Do you tell me how we're going to work out this majority leader's race? He said, turn it on. I said, you got 7,000 feet. And he said, I'll work it out. I'll work it out. It's done. It's done. So we put the power back in and landed at Peachtree to cab. And he called Terrell Starr at 1 in the morning, fired him off the Appropriations Committee, gave Don Johnson Appropriations Committee, and cleared the way for me to be majority leader.
Oh, my goodness. Well, it's been great having you.
Thank you, Bob. I really am. I'm flattered that you'd asked me to come over and do this. It's been fun reminiscing and talking about all this cast of characters that's come through that Capitol over there, you included.
Great memories.
Great memories. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Wayne.